So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next presenter, who's delivering our keynote session on coordinating national and international responses to emergency, lessons learned from 3 decades of frontline experience. Probably got the most qualified man in Australia to be able to deliver that, person in Australia to be able to deliver that today. Joe Buffone, who's the Deputy Coordinator General of the National Emergency Management Australia, NEMA. Joe is responsible for overseeing the Australian Government National Situation Room and coordination of the Australian Government Disaster Assistance, the non-financial part of that. Joe has more than 30 years of experience in security and disaster management and has held a number of key senior positions. Joe was also deployed to Victoria to establish the lead in the Victoria aged care response to the COVID pandemic outbreaks in the aged care sector. Joe has also held several executive positions over the last 15 years, such as Chief Officer of the Victorian Country Fire Authority, Deputy Emergency Management Commissioner of Victoria, and the Deputy Emergency Services Commissioner of Victoria. Joe has also had direct involvement in coordinating and responding to major emergencies in Australia and internationally at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels. And Joe also holds a Master's of Business, a grad in disaster management, and a diploma in security management. It gives me great pleasure to ask Joe Buffone to come up and join us.
Thanks very much. It gives me great pleasure to present here today. But before I proceed, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, but also those online, the lands that you may be in, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders that may be on this course. So I've got my bag here, which is actually the wicked problem and the system to actually deal with wicked problems. But I'll put that down there for the time being. So you wonder what the hell. It won't be. I'd like to pull out like a croc or a python or something like that, but it won't be. So dealing with risk. Hey, one thing I have to say, I've been really enthused. I only came here around lunchtime, but just to listen to some of the discussion about risk. I've actually been in the game for a long time. I actually started dealing with risk in disaster management in the very, very start of risk management coming into play in disaster management when 4360 was established by Gene Cross. And I was actually engaged in that, and then obviously now progressed into a whole range of different standards. But one thing I'm really pleased about was some of the discussions around not just about compliance. You know, I've been in organisations where I've seen some of the best compliant risk frameworks and risk systems that actually has never managed the risks that you're actually dealing with. So you can get a gold tick in terms of compliance, and you know the auditors, Paul, wherever he is, would be really, really happy with the outcome of that. But are you actually managing the risk? And then you burn a whole lot of capital in getting at the front end before you actually deal with managing it. So just a little bit of history. And in the VUCA space, there's an N as well. You can be a VUCAN, which is actually novel. And I think that's some of the things that we should be looking at. So the first thing I want to touch on, and I want to go straight to the core, is around community. You know, what is the business that we're in around wicked problems and going right to the core. Now, this woman here, I just want to touch on this because I have this photo in my office because this reminds me every day about what my business is about. Doesn't matter, I'm from Canberra, I can get caught in the ether, you know, in Canberra within the bureaucracy, but this reminds me, this woman was in Eugowra. She was with her toddler. She had to run from her house, climb up 2 cars, get onto the roof of her house with her toddler and wait 6.5 hours to be rescued, right? She did not want to leave her community. Her community was flooded. There was no services. You can see that was a shed in the showgrounds with donated goods. And this is a reminder around what my business is, but I would actually say what some of the collective wicked problems that we're dealing with actually needs to focus on. And, you know, the community deal with things at the grassroots level, but make sure strategy, policy, and operational frameworks that deal with risk actually cover that off. So a couple of quick things, and I've got quite a few slides, but I promise you I'm not going to speak in detail to each one of them right. In actual fact, if I go quick enough, it'll look like an animation, you know, as we sort of skip through. But I do want to touch on a couple of things around, you know, future risks. and in particular, consecutive cascading and compounding risk. And it's not just something that I've sort of dreamt up. You know, the UN IPCC spoke about complex, compound and cascading risks, and in particular, the point around the convergence of them. So multiple climate hazards will occur simultaneously, multiple climatic and non-climatic. So things like cyber risk, things like other anthropogenic risks that will actually intersect with the natural hazards and the natural environment, create a whole different complex world that we're actually dealing with. The second point is about feasible and effective adaptation. And we've heard about adaptation, and I actually think that that is one of the things that we can do, which you can do that right now. Every single one of us can start adapting by even our mindset right from this moment on. So I think an important part of where we're heading. What's the context now just in Australia? And this is just now. So since 2013, 116 deaths. And that does not include Black Saturday, 173 deaths, 2009. I was personally involved in that. You can read that yourself, but I can tell you now, NEMA is currently overseeing $20 billion of recovery programs, right? In the last few years, $20 billion of recovery programs nationally. Just put that into context. The other thing is right now, 80% of local government areas have had a disaster declaration and have been affected in some ways by recent disasters. So that's either bushfires, floods, overlay COVID with that, and then that doesn't even touch on some of the economic impacts, you know, some of the impacts on agriculture, etc. And just to put it into context, since 2015, you can see there's a number of international events that Australia has been directly involved in. And in actual fact, 18 of those I've been personally sort of involved at the national level, coordinating through Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Again, I'm not going to go through them. One that touches me the most, though, is the response to the volcano in New Zealand, where we repatriated 13 burns victims in 48 hours. Now, the reason I touch on that, it's the classic of what works well when you have government, private sector, defence, right, and a whole range of others that actually collaborate to get an outcome. And that was, to me, that was a case study that was exemplar in actually how that occurs. Domestically, again, here we go, since 2019, a whole list of current events, right, that sort of say this is what's been happening, including recently 2022, the floods in that period, and now we're moving back out of that into a warming cycle with higher risk fire season. Now, just for those, actually, I'll talk about that in a moment, because I don't want to jump my own slides. So just a quick one on NEMA, and I'm not going to bore you too much with it, but I do have to do a bit of an ad for NEMA. So it's a new agency. In actual fact, on Friday, we were 1 year old. So 1st of September, we were established, brought together Emergency Management Australia and the National Recovery and Resilience Agency together. So that means we've now got at the federal level, the agencies and capability to actually deal across the whole continuum of disaster management. But the fact is that we actually deal with all hazards. So my side of the shop, the emergency management response, I support health, I support biosecurity, cyber, and I'll talk a little bit about that around using the wicked solutions in here. I actually use that as part of dealing with the consequences of cyber, not the data elements of it, not the sort of disruption elements of it, but the consequences of it. We are the National Disaster Management Organisation. We're primary situational awareness and coordination, so national coordination, and we're very focused on resilience building, mitigation, and really shifting the dial from, they talk about 3% on mitigation. I'd probably say it's probably more around 20%, but anyway, that's debatable. But definitely shifting the dial, so we do more around resilience building. And in some instances, what do we talk about resilience? And there's a whole range of different definitions. But really, one of them is around social character, the other is around the economy, and the other one is around strong industry. And if you have those, then you actually, in different forms and guises, well, then you actually have a resilient nation. Our purpose, our vision, I'm not going to read through, but I do want to touch on our strategic objectives because they are driving the strategic agenda in a different way. Number one, leading and coordinating national action and assistance across emergency management continuum. So all the way from prevention, right through to, risk reduction, right through to reconstruction and then back into risk reduction. So that cycle. Building scalable, and this is an important thing around scalable emergency management capability. We're in a different environment, and I'll touch on the model that we've historically used to build our capability and what we need to look at going forward. The next one, which I actually think is probably the biggest one, and we did sort of talk about what does data mean, but building evidence, intelligence, and insights to empower communities, leaders, and stakeholders to make effective decisions. And that is that anticipatory element of it. So, strategic foresight and strategic insights into anticipating what impacts and consequences are, I actually think is the leading edge with some of the wicked problems. And then finally, reducing harm and the consequences of disasters and building back better through investment in people, capabilities, and communities. So there are our strategic objectives, and everything that we're doing is aligning to that, our investment. Quickly, risks and hazards now, you don't need to go through all of those. Bushfire, cyclone, severe storms, and cyber, terrorism, supply chain impacts, which was a big learning from COVID. But each one of these, really we can deal with each one of these and as their own. It's the interrelationship and the interdependencies when you get convergence, when you get concurrency, and when you get the compounding effects that can actually push into the catastrophic sphere of the continuum because of that. And Black Summer was the time when we really started to feel that, and then COVID as well. My concern with COVID at the moment I'm concerned that we're starting to forget some of the amazing lessons that we learned through COVID. Australia's future. This is actually from the intergenerational report, and it's interesting that the themes are aligned with what was discussed here. So for me, that's encouraging. The economic growth over the next 4 years, intergenerational report, they talk about 5 major forces. Population ageing, which flows into a whole range of issues around health, around workforce, around vulnerability. Technology and digital transformation, which are sort of spoken about, what does that look like? But there are pros to that too. It makes it potentially we will find solutions to things that we couldn't find solutions about. So let's leverage off that. But what does that mean in terms of risk? What does that mean in terms of vulnerability? Because I think sometimes leading edge creates vulnerabilities. Climate change and the net zero transformation, sometimes the unintended consequences of where we end up with net zero. And it's something we have to think about. And an important part. The geopolitical risk and the fragmentation of that environment is critical. It's changed. Never since 1945 have we faced the convergence of these risks as a nation. So an important point. So this is what our season looks like, right? I just wanted to touch on it now. Straight away, you see in Australia over the next few months the potential in a natural space to have bushfires, to have severe weather, to have east coast lows, to have cyclones, to have heat wave, which for me, heat wave is probably the biggest risk that I am concerned about. We've seen it in Europe, different sort of environment in Australia, but still a significant risk. And how collectively are we prepared for that? Now, this is the point that this is the diagram that I wanted to talk about around the model that we have. So if you have a look at the left, the axis on the left side, it talks about capacity and capability to manage the risk. So that's our collective capability to actually and capacity to manage the risk. And then as you move along the bottom axis, it talks about disaster intensity and consequences. Starts at low to moderate, moves along the right-hand side until we get to catastrophic, right? All of our capability systems have been built on the left-hand side model. Historically, what we understand, historically, what we know, and historically, what we're prepared to invest in our capability and ability to manage risk. It hits a sweet spot in the middle. It hits a point where the demands from the event or from the potential of the event and your capability actually hit an equilibrium. So what happens there? You either start to look at how you can optimize other systems to put in, and that's what we did during COVID. So as we move towards the right-hand side of the screen, and as we head towards that catastrophic, in actual fact, what happens with our capability and ability, our capacity and capabilities to manage risk is the catastrophic element goes up exponentially, and our capabilities actually drop off unless we have systems that can adapt. So that adaptation thing becomes absolutely critical. And for us, NEMA is focused on that right-hand side. What are we doing about it then? So, okay, the wicked problem, what are we doing about it? One is around having a preparedness framework that we can actually start looking at. What are the gaps on that right-hand side? What do we need to do? Remember, we operate in a federation as well, a critical part. States and territories have sovereign responsibility and are in the Constitution to deal with their own risks, crisis management, and many of you would understand that. And we spoke with somebody mentioned around, what did that mean when we sort of went into COVID and then all of a sudden internal, we shut down borders. That wasn't in any of the plans, I can guarantee that. So how do we prepare for that? Well, at the national level, we've got 21 capability bricks that we're looking at, and we're looking at what the gaps are to actually understand what level we have both within jurisdictions, nationally, how we reach out internationally, and also in the private sector. And I'll touch on what it means around optimising whole of society rather than looking at just government dealing with the problem. The other thing that we're doing, back to that thing around anticipating, so that strategic foresight, having near real-time, unstructured data and disaggregated data that we can actually pull in and overlay over structured data, but quickly. Time is the essence. Time is absolutely critical, and for me, delay is absolute disasters. As part of that, we've actually got now a joint operating picture, the first time nationally where you can look through and actually see what's happening nationally in terms of a range of disasters. That's still on a bit of a maturity journey and is actually only for government at the moment. The future is that we can actually share it with industry so that industry can actually have a look at some of the risks through one portal. The point around strategic foresight we've developed, which is actually derivative, anybody that's either current military or ex-military, around military appreciation. We've actually civilianised that methodology and wrapped it up into a strategic foresight model where you actually work through it in a methodological way and predominantly focus at the strategic and interface with the operational level. And this is some of the products that are drawn from that. This example is Lake Eppalock. Anybody that knows in Victoria, due to the floods, saturation, a lot of the water storages are absolutely maximum. Doesn't take a lot now to fill those, and ultimately they may have to release water from them that then in turn creates an unintended consequence of flooding. So, second, third, fourth tier consequences. So some of the products by going through that approach is actually saying this is the capacity, historical context of floods, water storages, and community sentiment as well around how the community are feeling, because they're actually more vulnerable because they're being continually under stress from a range of different threats. And then we do some analysis, and we look at most likely scenario impacts, most dangerous scenario impacts, and then what the actual some of the data around the actual local government area. And again, just focusing on what then are the lines of effort that you may apply to actually minimise some of the impacts. And the interesting thing about some of these complex systems, we talk about fixing. Do we actually fix it? I don't talk about fixing. I talk about stabilisation so the system can continue to operate, and then fixing it down the track. I can tell you when I was deployed to Victoria with the aged care response, the system was already fragile, right? And there was no way known I was going to fix anything. My job was to stabilise it so that the system didn't actually fail in its entirety. Okay, I'm sure many of you have heard about the butterfly effect. If not, I'll give you a quick 101 around it. So there was a meteorologist, Lorenz, who actually was working through a whole lot of formula. Without boring you with too much, although I think a lot of you are actually data, focused people anyway. And I'm a budding data nerd. I'm still just learning though around data. And he actually came up with this thing that, he came up with a question around if you in complex systems that are non-linear, right? That are non-linear, and a state of and deterministic. That a small movement at one point, when you get second, third, fourth tier sort of flow on impacts, can have significant impacts elsewhere. And it's sort of come up with saying that, the butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon could create a tornado in Texas. That's the sort of degree. And in actual fact, when you see what happens in complex adaptive systems, that's actually correct. So the thing about non-linear and actually being able to stabilise is very much what the change is in our entire systems. Globalisation, changes in community, even community licensing, of what they actually want changes the dimensions quite significantly. I'll jump that. Just as a bit of background, I used this concept when I was dealing with the aged care, and the red butterfly was actually used within aged care facilities to determine in the very early stages when we knew very little about COVID, that resident was positive with COVID. And we actually termed our Operation Red Butterfly Assist, because our mission was to stabilise this complex environment and a complex system. So we use that as a symbol for our operation. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time, but there is a difference between complicated and complex. And it's back into the non-linear aspects around it, and that you have to actually find, that small inputs have disproportionate effects down in some other aspects of the system. So I wanted to give you a bit of confidence that there are crisis management arrangements at the national level. And this is my favourite slide, because we manage, significant, nationally significant disasters and crises through this frame. And it actually works really well. But what I love about it is if you have a look at it, it's all nice boxes. They've all got double arrows. So we're engaging and we're communicating. It's hierarchical, because of course that's actually how the system operates. It actually does operate well, but how it's represented is very, very different to how it operates. And this is actually how it does operate, right? This is the real world, right? And in actual fact, you have a look on the right, on the right-hand side, this is actually from the US, and it's got the president in the middle and how the US sort of political system works. On the left, it's actually got FEMA, so our equivalent in the US, and how it operates. Oh, I've got an indicator.
5 minutes, mate.
Very quickly. So, perfect timing, in fact, because how do we actually operate in that complex environment? So, of course, this is, right, the dynamics of a complex system and wicked problems. And what it actually does, when you have a look at how it operates, is this is the ecosystem that we operate in. Each one of these nodes are the built environment, the economic environment, cyber, health, the human element of it all. And it operates in each one of those, and we've already talked about that, and it pulses. And there are times when it actually, fragments a bit, but it problem solves within each little domain until the pressure builds on the system, and then eventually it comes into the centre. And what we do when it comes into the centre, that's what the National Coordination Mechanism has been doing over the past few years. It actually connects those nodes. It brings in anybody that has equity in problem definition, in resolution, in stabilisation, and then actually tasks, coordinates, communicates in a collaborative way. There is no legislation to this. This is actually part of that system. Then what happens is as you start to put the lines of effort in, the system starts to stabilise. Then again, you bring it in because there are more problems, and then the system stabilises again. And then you continue to do it until the system resets to a point where it continues to function. And that's really the explanation of what you see up on the screen as the National Coordination Mechanism. How many minutes, Dave?
There are a couple of questions as well. So
okay. I wanted to give you an actual example of this, how it actually operated. So it's not just a theory. In actual fact, that mechanism has met 540 times in the last 2 years. They run for an hour. They cut through red tape. They identify what the problems are. This here was a classic where there was flooding in South Australia. Now, it was serious flooding, but not as bad as what we've seen through La Nina. What it did do, though, is it landed in the most vulnerable supply chain point in the country. What it did, it knocked out the rail link to north-south to the north, knocked out the rail link to the west, knocked out the Stuart Highway. And you go, okay, well, so what? You know, all right, it's out for a bit. It's out for a bit, except it was going to be out for weeks. What did that do? Load up the transport network that was already loaded up because of COVID. What did it do? It actually told us that Northern Territory relies on the south and the east for its fresh food. Its entire fresh food supply comes from the south and comes from the east. It told us that the east, so west, relied on essential groceries from the east, and there was also some specific chemicals that were used for water purification and for sewage treatment that we didn't have shortages. So we had shortages that were going to be critical, where potentially we're going to have boil water notices and release sewage into the environment, right? Untreated sewage. So through the National Coordination Mechanism, brought 3 states together, brought the rail operators together, brought the private sector together, and actually worked through what specific problems that we're dealing with, what the solutions were. The other thing just to be aware is we bring ACCC into this so that we don't have anti-competition or nobody's breaching anti-competition laws. And just as a quick example, within 48 hours, the heavy vehicle regulator had redesigned routes to provide road trains right into Darwin and right into WA. We changed the regulations of shipping, coastal shipping, from international shipping, where they could actually do resupply. We had bridges, both road bridges that were mixed with rail bridges to get supply in, and a private sector company, transport company, come up with a solution to use specific containers to get normal goods over and then bring this chemical back, and actually broke the back of the supply chain issue with that chemical. Now, that's just one example, and I could speak for many, many more minutes on this particular issue, but I just wanted to give you a very specific example. So just in conclusion, and this is a quote from the Royal Commission, but I think that this is probably our collective mantra. Whole of nation effort and cooperation is necessary to make Australia more resilient to natural disasters. It calls for action, not only from governments, individuals, but also from industry, business, charities, volunteers, media, community groups, and others. And that's the practice that we're running. The power of private sector, the power of the non-government organisations, the power of community we underestimate as well, and how we harness that to optimise the collective capabilities for wicked problems and actually use collaboration with no laws, policy setting, but just using collaboration and using the power of those systems is very much the way forward. Thanks. Virus will escape.
Did you build it yourself?
Sorry?
Did you make it yourself?
I wish I did.
Just 2 points that really stood out for me before we get on to the questions is, Joe, you started off by saying that compliance alone is not going to yield effective solutions, and that's so true. And then just a comment on this slide, my learned colleague and friend, Dr. Paul Johnson at the back, always says that we may not all be accountable, but we are certainly all responsible. We all have a role to play in this. Joe, just a couple of questions that are really good that came through, which I might pose to you. Anonymous has asked, how has the rise of misinformation and social media impacted the coordination and effectiveness of emergency responses?
Yeah, it's a really good question. To be honest, I don't focus too much on it because I actually think that the system can actually be self-regulating in a lot of ways. If I followed that rule, we actually do open source. We use open source as a key intelligence gathering for us. And what we do is we ground truth. So we'll pull it together, and if something says X is happening, we'll ground truth it. I know it's different in some other environments, in particular in the national security space, and sort of how we actually, some of the so in that environment, it's definitely some different aspects. But in terms of the natural hazards and the crisis management, I don't get too caught up in it. I actually think that you use multiple sources of intelligence, you validate it, and then you act on what you know. And the reality is, I run the principle of I'd rather act on 20-30% knowledge and make a decision than actually be paralysed waiting to get the 100%. And I know there's probably a few engineers in here and scientists, and they generally don't like me too much because in the main, scientists want 110% peer reviewed, as do engineers. They want the data to show that it's correct. But in crisis management, you've got to actually take risk to manage risk, right? If you don't take risk, you're not going to manage risk.
That's opened up a whole can of worms that we can talk about in effective communication. But let's move on. In your 3 decades of experience, what role has technology advancements played in both aiding and complicating emergency management?
Yeah, look, I think, that in some ways, having that situational awareness has increased incredibly through technology. Satellites, just social media alone, the ability to sort of do analysis very, very quickly. The speed to action, to me, is the most critical thing. The vulnerability is that we become dependent on it. So, I can still run an ops room with whiteboards, and in actual fact, that's what I ran down in Victoria when I started, that. But, you become too reliant on it. You have to have contingencies as a fallback. So technology for me is, I absolutely love it. It doesn't like me. It's sort of every time my staff see me go near in our interactive boards or that, they start trembling. But in actual fact, it really is the leading edge. And I think it's what's going to make the difference for us in the future. But we have to be prepared. Space weather, I'll give you an example. Space weather, 2025 is the highest risk period for space weather. If we get that impacting on us now, we will have very limited comms, probably no comms. How are you all going to operate with your crisis management and your business continuity in that environment? So we're actually working on that to see how that will actually occur.
And effectively, it's about effectively getting that dance between man versus machine right to effectively get good outcomes. And then the last question, not often we get to those times, so I just want to go one more question. To what extent do economic constraints impact the ability of nations to cooperate effectively in times of emergency? And how can these challenges be mitigated?
Yeah, I think it's a bit, the diagram I showed you around going, that catastrophic thing. I mean, there's not an endless bucket of money, and how much do you pour into mitigation? So it's, the balance. Society still has to function. You still got to run hospitals. You still got to run education systems. For me, it's actually about how you optimise, the whole of society, but also our partners internationally. I'm currently negotiating with 5 different countries for MOUs so that we can share resources. During the floods, we had Singapore come over. Never thought we would go to Singapore for flood rescue capability. Not because we'd run out, but because we'd actually exhausted our teams and we needed to sort of give them some sort of relief. So for me, you've got to invest in the right, to get that base right. And I also believe that if you get a system, it doesn't have to be perfect, but if you've got a system, when you're either starting to go into a crisis or you're actually in crisis, you can ramp that up and you can adapt very, very quickly. If you're starting from a zero base, then it's nearly, you're literally behind the 8 ball. So it's a balance between having the right capability for the risk, but being able to scale quickly and optimise whole of society. That's one of our focus at the moment. You would have seen the Defence Strategic Review and the point that defence but they're not going to be the point of first call. We're doing a lot of work on how do we optimise whole of society as we move along that continuum.
There are a few more questions, unfortunately. Apologies to those who submitted questions and we can't get to them. Could listen to you all day long. Thank you very much for your time.